I used to think a live audience kept the worst from happening on camera, but these cases prove me wrong. From a correspondent reporting in what felt like the worst city in the world, to a dancer delivering the strongest performance of her life in the most breathtaking way possible. This is Tucker from Last Moments. It was November 22, 2016, and Mosul, Iraq, was not a city at peace. The streets in contested districts carried the kind of silence that doesn't feel like quiet. It feels like waiting. Burned-out vehicles sat at intersections. Shattered masonry lined the curbs. Civilians had cleared the area earlier that morning. The air was thick with dust and tension. That was the environment Riley Kess walked into with her crew. Riley was 29 years old and had been working as a field correspondent long enough to know how to carry herself in places like this. She wasn't reckless. People who knew her described her as composed and deliberate, the kind of person who read a room before she opened her mouth. She had built a reputation for controlled reporting in environments that would rattle most people. She was good at her job, but not in an arrogant way. More in the way that someone who has done something difficult enough times starts to trust their own footing. With her that day were two people she worked alongside regularly. Her camera operator was a 34-year-old freelancer who had covered conflict zones across the region. Their local fixer was a 41-year-old former teacher who had transitioned into translation and logistics work as the city's situation deteriorated. He knew the streets, the language, and how to read a neighborhood faster than anyone. They set up roughly 120 yards from a damaged intersection where fighting had taken place earlier that morning. The location gave them a clear visual backdrop without putting them directly in an active zone. Riley wore a ballistic vest but had removed her helmet for the segment, something some correspondents do briefly to appear more visible on camera, even in unstable environments. From where they stood, the scene looked manageable. The fighting had moved on. The live segment began without incident, already being transmitted back to their network. Distant gunfire was audible, but nothing that suggested immediate danger. Riley was mid-report when it happened. A command-detonated improvised explosive device detonated approximately 25 to 30 feet to her right. The thing is, with what they knew at the time, the location made sense. They weren't being careless. They thought the area had already been cleared. That's what makes it hard to process. The blast sent lateral shrapnel across the scene instantly. A jagged metal fragment struck Riley on the side of her neck and severed major blood vessels. The force knocked her backward, and the live feed captured the moment her voice stopped before the signal abruptly cut. Not gradually, not with a cry, just an abrupt cut to nothing. Her crew pulled her behind partial cover. The bleeding was immediate and severe. There was no field intervention that could have addressed an injury of that nature in that location. Local responders arrived approximately 6 minutes later. Riley was pronounced dead at the scene. Investigators concluded the device had been command detonated, triggered remotely from a concealed position. Someone made a deliberate decision to set it off at that moment, from a vantage point that was never identified. No one was ever charged. She had gone to Mosul to show people what was happening in a city most of them would only ever see through a screen. What the investigation couldn't close was the fact that the warning signs weren't signs at all. They were just the ordinary conditions of the place she was standing in. And sometimes that's all it takes. A lot of you said in my last video this could never happen to you, that you'd never put yourself in a situation like that, and maybe you're right. But the next case is different, because this time there was no conflict zone, no war, no enemy. There was a crowd, a ramp, and a man who had done this his whole life and believed he still could. And what happened in those few seconds in Texas is something I genuinely wasn't prepared for when I first came across it. It was May 22nd, 2017, and Odessa, Texas was the kind of hot that settles into the pavement and doesn't let go. The event grounds were packed by mid-afternoon. Folding chairs, vendor tents, the smell of exhaust and sunscreen. The stunt was being filmed for a local broadcast, with cameras already set up along the run. 12 sedans lined a stretch of flat ground, spanning roughly 110 feet. A launch ramp sat at one end, angled at about 28 degrees. A landing ramp waited at the other, sitting about 18 inches lower. The crowd had come to see someone fly over all of it. Vance was 41 and had spent most of his adult life on a motorcycle. He started doing stunt work in his early 20s, built a regional following, and earned a reputation as someone who committed fully to whatever he attempted. What most of the crowd didn't know was that Vance was coming back from a prior spinal compression injury. This was his return, his way of proving, maybe to himself as much as anyone, that he still had it. His crew included an event host, 2 mechanics who had prepped the bike, and spotters positioned along the car line. The motorcycle had been modified for durability, but still ran on standard suspension. That detail would matter later. What I keep thinking about is how much preparation went into it, and how none of it accounted for the one variable that couldn't be controlled on the day. The ramp angles had been measured. Everything looked right from the outside. Vance mounted the bike, ran through his checks, and lined up at the start of his approach. Witnesses described him as calm, no visible hesitation. He had done versions of this hundreds of times. He accelerated toward the ramp. About midway through, the rear tire briefly lost traction on the warm pavement before stabilizing. He hit the ramp and launched. The problem was speed. Post-incident analysis estimated his launch velocity at between 58 and 60 miles per hour. The jump required slightly more speed than he carried into the ramp. It wasn't a dramatic shortfall, just enough to change the arc. He cleared the first 9 cars cleanly. Then the bike began dropping earlier than it should have. The front wheel came down on the roof of the 10th car. The impact killed the forward momentum almost instantly. The bike pitched forward, and Vance was thrown over the handlebars, traveling 15 to 18 feet before his helmet struck the pavement at a steep downward angle. The cameras captured the moment of impact before the broadcast was cut away seconds later. The force was transferred directly into his neck. His body rotated once before coming to rest. The motorcycle landed separately several feet away. I've gone through accounts of jumps gone wrong before, and what always gets me is how fast the margin disappears. A couple of miles per hour, a few feet of distance. That's the entire difference between clearing it and what happened to Vance. The spotters reached him within roughly 20 seconds. He was unresponsive with no coordinated movement. No effective breathing was observed. Neck alignment was visibly compromised. Emergency responders arrived approximately 7 minutes after the fall. Vance Thrall was pronounced dead shortly after. Investigators identified 2 primary causes: launch speed below the required threshold and the 18-inch ramp height difference, which reduced the margin for error and increased the drop on landing for an already underpowered approach. No criminal findings were issued. The official cause of death was severe traumatic injury to the head and cervical spine. Vance had spent 2 decades doing something most people wouldn't attempt once, and he came back to do it again after an injury that probably should have given him reason not to. Whether that was courage or something else, I'll leave that to you. The ramps were dismantled the same evening. By the next morning, the only thing left on that stretch of ground was the skid mark from his approach. Looking back, it can feel like the outcome was obvious, like the signs were there and someone should have stepped in, and maybe that's true. But the next case I found doesn't involve a ramp or a crowd or any kind of performance at all. It happened in a public plaza on an ordinary morning, and the danger didn't come from the environment. It came from someone who was already there, waiting. It was August 3rd, 2015, and Jacksonville, Florida was already warm by morning, the kind of humid that makes the air feel thick before the day even gets started. A public plaza in one of the city's busier districts had been set up for a community event. Foot traffic was steady, vendors lined the edges, and the noise of a crowd filled the space, busy enough to feel alive, open enough to shoot cleanly. That was why Joni Blate was there. Joni was 32 years old and worked as a morning field reporter. She had been in local broadcasting long enough to move comfortably through live segments, the kind of professional who could reset mid-sentence if something went sideways and never let it show. She was good under pressure, and she genuinely liked what she did. Her camera operator that morning was 27, positioned roughly 8 to 10 feet away with wireless audio equipment. Nothing about the setup was unusual. What Joni didn't know, what nobody on that crew knew, was that someone else had already arrived at the plaza before them. Darren Pike was 35 years old. He and Joni had been in a relationship that ended 4 months earlier, and by the time it was over, things had already become difficult. There had been confrontations, workplace incidents, complaints filed. The messages he sent afterward weren't the kind that suggest someone moving on. They suggest someone building a case in their own head, assigning blame, and circling back to it. He had been unemployed and convinced himself that Joni was responsible for how his life had gone. That kind of thinking doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes the whole story until one day they decide to do something about it. Witnesses confirmed he had been at the plaza before the broadcast began, pacing, watching, present in a way that, in hindsight, meant something. The live segment started normally, already being broadcast back to the station. Darren approached from behind, called her name once, then wrapped his arm tightly around her neck, a rear chokehold, applying sustained pressure to her neck and restricting both airflow and blood circulation. The camera continued recording as the situation unfolded, capturing everything before the broadcast was cut. She was pulled backward, and her movement became restricted almost immediately. When I went through the witness accounts, the detail that stayed with me was the hesitation. People saw it happening and didn't move right away. I don't say that to judge anyone. That freeze response is well documented and completely human, but those seconds compounded into something that couldn't be undone. The hold continued long enough that by the time he was pulled away, she was already unresponsive. Bystanders eventually tackled Darren and forced him to release her, but Joni had already lost consciousness and was unresponsive on the ground. CPR was started within 1 to 2 minutes. Emergency responders arrived approximately 6 minutes after the incident began. She was pronounced dead shortly after being transported to the hospital. The official cause was prolonged oxygen deprivation combined with compression injury to the neck. The duration and severity of the compression had already caused critical injury before help could reverse it. Darren was detained at the scene without resistance. The message history, witness accounts, and broadcast footage formed the basis of the case against him. He entered a plea, and sentencing followed. The investigation closed with a conviction. What it couldn't account for was the gap between the complaints that were filed and the morning nothing was done about them. That gap had a cost, and Joni paid it. A lot of cases I cover come down to environment or equipment or a split-second mistake. This one was different. The warnings existed on paper. The next story is different again, because this time the danger was something Yulene Vaush had rehearsed for, prepared for, and still couldn't get out of. The line between performance and catastrophe turned out to be thinner than anyone in that room expected. It was June 11th, 2018 in Phoenix, Arizona, and outside, the heat was already intense. Inside the venue, the air was controlled, the lighting set, and around 100 people sat just 10 to 15 feet from a large transparent tank at the center of the space. The performance was being filmed for a live-streamed broadcast, with cameras positioned around it. The tank stood about 6 feet tall and 4 feet wide, filled nearly to the brim with clear water, visible from every angle. Nothing about what was about to happen was meant to be hidden. Yulene Vaush was 27 years old and had been performing escape acts for several years. Within the regional circuit of live performance and independent shows, she had built a steady following. People who had seen her work described her as precise and controlled, someone who treated every performance like a technical problem to be solved. She rehearsed obsessively, knew her equipment, and understood that the margin between a clean escape and a serious emergency was entirely dependent on preparation. Her assistant was 31, someone she had worked with across multiple performances. He knew the routine, knew the equipment, and had been trained on the emergency unlock procedure, a backup system built into the restraint setup for situations where Yulene couldn't complete the release herself. The restraints were chains and padlocks, and the timed release mechanism had been demonstrated to the audience earlier as part of the buildup. Everything had a contingency, and that's the part that makes this story hard to sit with from the start. This wasn't a case of corners being cut or risks being ignored. The safety systems existed. The people in the room knew what to do, and it still went wrong. Yulene was lowered into the tank, restrained and submerged. The audience watched through the transparent walls as she began working through the escape sequence. Witnesses described the early portion as smooth. She was moving with the deliberate efficiency that comes from doing something hundreds of times. Then, at around the 45-second mark, one of her wrists shifted out of alignment within the restraint, a small positional change that put her hand at the wrong angle to reach the release mechanism. She tried to correct it. She couldn't get her arm where it needed to be. Her assistant was watching through the tank wall. The problem was that her movements, even as they became more urgent, didn't look dramatically different from the performance itself, at least not right away. Witnesses confirmed there was a period where people closest to the tank weren't certain whether what they were seeing was part of the act or something going wrong. That hesitation cost time. When the assistant recognized the situation and moved to intervene, the emergency unlock didn't engage cleanly on the first attempt. The chain tension created by Yulene's position made the keyway difficult to access and align under real conditions. A second attempt was needed. By the time the restraints were cleared and she was pulled from the tank, she had been submerged for over 3 minutes, much of it without effective movement. Her movements had slowed well before extraction began, and by the time she was out of the water, she was no longer moving at all. The cameras continued recording as the situation unfolded, capturing the moment before the broadcast was cut. CPR was initiated immediately. Paramedics arrived approximately 5 minutes later and continued resuscitation efforts on scene. Yulene Vaush was pronounced dead shortly after at the hospital. The post-incident investigation examined the restraint hardware, the tank, the emergency unlock mechanism, and the full sequence of events reconstructed from witness accounts and available footage. The restraint itself had not malfunctioned. The misalignment was positional. The emergency unlock delay was attributed to chain tension created by Yulene's body position in the water, which made the keyway difficult to access and align under real conditions. The official cause of death was hypoxic brain injury resulting from prolonged submersion. Investigators concluded that 2 factors drove the outcome: delayed recognition of distress and the mechanical difficulty of the emergency unlock under pressure. No criminal charges were filed. The tank was drained and removed from the venue the same night. The restraint hardware was retained as part of the evidentiary record and examined by an independent reviewer whose findings aligned with the official report. For Yulene Vaush, preparation wasn't just a habit, it was a conviction. She had built her career on it, and it had rarely let her down. But what waited for her inside that tank refused to be rehearsed, and the space between ready and not ready turned out to be exactly wide enough to cost her. The next case is different in almost every way. Different setting, different circumstances, and a completely different kind of risk. But the outcome was just as final. It was September 9th, 2017, and Chicago, Illinois was a crisp early autumn evening. The competition hall was packed. Judges sat at a long table directly facing the stage, and multiple cameras were positioned around the floor, capturing the event for a live broadcast. The stage itself was hardwood with roughly a 1-inch mat overlay, standard for competitive dance events. The lighting was sharp and deliberate, making every movement readable from the back row. Everything about the environment had been designed to put the performers front and center. Kira was 24 years old and had been competing in dance since she was a child. By her early 20s, she had developed a reputation for routines that pushed physical limits, not recklessly, but with the kind of calculated ambition that separates competitors who place from competitors who win. People who trained alongside her described someone deeply serious about the craft. The kind of person who ran a sequence until it was automatic. She wasn't flashy off stage. She saved that for the floor. Her partner was 26, trained specifically in lifts and acrobatic partnering. The two had been working together long enough to develop real trust in each other's timing. Their finals routine escalated toward a finishing lift designed as the centerpiece of the entire performance, a rotational release where the partner generates momentum and lets go at a precise point, allowing the flyer to complete the arc before landing. It required exact grip, exact timing, and exact body position from both of them simultaneously. They had rehearsed it many times. It had worked. What the judges and audience saw in the early portions of the routine was exactly what Kira and her partner had prepared. The opening sequences were clean, the transitions landed on the music, and witnesses described the performance as one of the strongest of the evening. The energy in the room had shifted in the way it does when something is going well, and everyone can feel it. Then came the final sequence. Her partner initiated the lift. Witnesses and available footage confirmed his grip was slightly off-center as he generated the rotation, not dramatically, but enough to alter the release angle. The rotation accelerated, and when the release came, Kira's body was not in the position needed to complete the arc cleanly. Instead of finishing the rotation upright, she was projected forward and downward. When I went through the footage analysis and witness accounts, the thing that struck me was how small the initial error was. A grip slightly off-center. That's it. Everything that followed came from that one adjustment that was never made. She had no time to correct her position. Her head contacted the stage first, followed immediately by her upper torso. The impact was direct and forceful, with the force concentrated through her head and neck. Witnesses described a brief involuntary movement after impact, followed by complete stillness. The cameras continued recording as the incident unfolded before the broadcast was cut. The music continued for a moment before someone cut it. The room went quiet in the way that only happens when everyone present understands simultaneously that something is seriously wrong. Staff reached her within roughly 10 seconds. She was unresponsive with no coordinated movement. Those on scene maintained her neck alignment and did not attempt to move her. Her partner did not leave her side. Emergency responders arrived approximately 6 minutes after the incident. Kira was transported for further care and pronounced dead shortly after arrival. This one sits differently for me than most cases I cover. Because the routine had been working, the room was with her. And then one grip, slightly off, changed everything in a fraction of a second. The post-incident investigation drew on witness statements, judging panel observations, and multi-angle footage. Investigators confirmed the grip misalignment as the initiating factor, noting the off-center hold altered the release trajectory in a way that made a clean landing impossible at that speed and angle. Two contributing factors were identified: the grip error and a choreographic modification introduced late in the rehearsal period that had narrowed the timing window for the release. The official cause of death was severe traumatic injury to the head and cervical spine. The matte overlay was examined and confirmed to meet standard specifications, meaning the surface was not a contributing factor. No criminal findings were issued. The multi-angle footage was retained as the primary evidentiary record. The competition was suspended for the remainder of the evening. Keira Glint spent her entire life building toward performances like the one she was in the middle of that night. What the investigation couldn't measure was how little separated the version of that night, where everything worked, from the one that actually happened. One grip slightly off. That was the whole distance.